I have spent 40 years perfecting the silence of a house. I know which floorboards groan under weight and which shadows can hold a human form without a ripple. They think I am a fading woman, a ghost drifting through the hallways of a life I no longer own. They speak over me at dinner as if I am a piece of furniture, discussing my declining faculties and my useless presence. But tonight, the silence became my weapon. I stood in the darkened corridor, my breath held tight, and listened to my husband and my own mother discuss the mechanics of my disappearance. They didn't see me. They never do. I need to know what happened. Please, subscribe, like, and comment below if you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home. Your support helps me tell the stories that usually die in the dark. What do you do when the people you've spent your life protecting decide that you are worth more dead than alive? The hallway carpet is a deep, bruised burgundy. It was a gift from Julian for our 25th anniversary, though I was the one who drove to the warehouse to pick it up, and I was the one who wrote the check from our joint account, the one he assumes is funded by his dwindling consulting fees. It muffles footsteps perfectly. That is its only virtue. I was standing near the linen closet, a stack of freshly laundered towels in my arms, when I heard the click of the library door. It's a heavy oak door, the kind that usually commands respect, but tonight it swung shut with a furtive, oily smoothness. The stairs are the most logical, my mother's voice drifted through the gap. Beatrice has a voice like fine grit, dry, abrasive, and unmistakably expensive. She's been complaining about her knees for months. A dizzy spell, a misplaced foot. It's a tragedy waiting to happen. "It has to be clean, Beatrice," Julian replied. His voice was lower, vibrating with a nervous energy I recognized from his failed business pitches. "If the insurance investigator sees even a hint of struggle, the Thorn policy won't pay out. And God knows we need that payout. Connor's creditors are calling the house now." "Eleanor doesn't struggle," my mother said, and I could almost hear the dismissive wave of her hand. "She accepts. It's her primary trait. She spent 30 years accepting your failures and my moods. She'll accept the fall just as quietly." I stood very still. The smell of the lavender detergent on the towels was suddenly cloying, making my throat tighten. I didn't drop the laundry. I didn't gasp. I simply leaned my shoulder against the wall and waited for the world to stop spinning. In their eyes, I am the Thorn girl who married the unlucky architect. They believe my father died penniless, and that we are living on the fumes of Julian's past successes and my mother's stipend. They don't know that the stipend comes from me. They don't know that when my father died, he left the entirety of the Thorn shipping holdings to me, and me alone, because he knew my mother would spend it on emeralds, and my husband would burn it on ego. For 3 decades, I have filtered money through a labyrinth of trusts and shell companies, feeding them just enough to keep the lights on, watching them reveal their true natures in the face of modest means. I thought I was teaching them humility. It turns out, I was only feeding their resentment. "Tuesday," Julian said. "You'll take her to that garden center in the morning. Get her tired. Make sure she skips lunch. By the time the sun sets, she'll be unsteady. I'll handle the rest near the basement landing." "Don't be sentimental, Julian," my mother snapped. "It's a mercy, really. What kind of life does she have? She wanders this house like a moth. It's time to put her behind glass." The library door creaked. I moved then, not with panic, but with the practiced efficiency of a shadow. I slipped into the guest bathroom, closed the door without a sound, and sat on the edge of the tub. I looked at my hands. They were steady, which surprised me. They are the hands of a woman who has peeled 10,000 potatoes, signed 1,000 school permission slips, and quietly authorized multi-million-dollar wire transfers from a laptop hidden in a sewing kit. I heard Julian's footsteps pass the door. He was whistling, a thin, reedy tune he only uses when he thinks he's solved a difficult problem. He sounded relieved. He sounded like a man who had finally found a way to balance his books. Dinner that night was a masterclass in domestic theater. Lydia had come over, complaining about the rising costs of her country club membership. Connor sat across from her, his eyes bloodshot, checking his phone under the table every 30 seconds. "Mom, you're staring," Lydia said, her lip curling slightly as she looked at me. "Is the roast too dry? You've been sitting there for 5 minutes without taking a bite." "I was just thinking about the garden," I said. My voice sounded thin, even to my own ears. "Your grandmother wants to go to the nursery on Tuesday." Beatrice didn't look up from her salad. She used her fork to precisely move a cherry tomato. "It'll be good for you, Eleanor. You've been looking so gray lately. A bit of fresh air before the weekends." "I'd like that," I replied. Julian reached over and patted my hand. His skin was dry, his touch devoid of any warmth. It was the touch of a man checking the ripeness of a fruit he intended to discard. "We just want what's best for you, Elle. You've worked so hard for this family. You deserve a rest." "A rest," I repeated. I looked around the table. My daughter, who only visited when she needed a check I borrowed from the grocery budget. My son, who hadn't looked me in the eye in 3 years. My mother, who had birthed me but never loved me. And my husband, the man who was currently calculating the velocity of my body hitting the basement floor. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. For years, I had played the part of the martyr, thinking that my silence was a form of protection. I thought that if I absorbed the damage, the structure would hold. But the structure was rotten. They weren't just exploiting the poor woman I pretended to be. They were actively trying to erase her for the sake of a payout that didn't even exist. The policy they were referring to, the Thorn policy, was voided years ago. I had canceled it when I realized Julian had tried to increase the premium without my signature. They were planning a murder for a pot of gold that was already empty. "Are you okay, Mom?" Connor asked, though his eyes were on his phone. "You look different." "I'm fine, Connor," I said, picking up my knife. The silver was heavy, a relic from my grandmother's set. I was just realizing that I've spent a long time keeping things quiet. Perhaps too long. "Well, silence is a virtue," Beatrice said, finally looking at me. Her eyes were like chips of blue glass. "Though, in your case, it's always been more of a mask for a lack of thoughts." I smiled at her. It was the first real smile I had felt in a decade. It felt sharp. "You're right, Mother. Silence is a mask, and I think I'm finally ready to take mine off." Julian's hand flinched on the table, just a fraction of an inch. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm looking forward to Tuesday," I said. I stood up and began to clear the plates. They didn't offer to help. They never do. As I walked into the kitchen, I could hear their voices dropping back into their usual rhythm of complaints and demands. They had already forgotten I was in the room. I placed the plates in the sink and looked out the window at the dark expanse of the backyard. On Tuesday, they expected a tragedy. They expected a broken woman at the bottom of the stairs. They have no idea that the woman they are trying to kill died a long time ago. And the woman who replaced her is much, much wealthier than they could ever imagine, and twice as dangerous. Monday morning arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sun spilled across the breakfast nook, highlighting the dust motes I hadn't yet wiped away and the hairline cracks in the porcelain cups I'd inherited from an aunt everyone else had forgotten. I was at the stove, the smell of browning butter filling the air. It's a scent that usually signifies comfort, but today it felt like a shroud. Behind me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Julian's slippers. In the past, that sound had been the heartbeat of my home. Now, it was the sound of a predator approaching. "Smells good, Elle," Julian said. He came up behind me, his hands hovering near my waist before settling on the counter. He didn't touch me. He hasn't touched me with genuine affection in a decade, but the proximity was suffocating. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice steady as I flipped an omelet. The house felt loud last night. I felt him stiffen, just a momentary hitch in his breathing. "Loud? It's an old house, honey. Just the pipes settling. You're probably just anxious about the gardening trip with your mother tomorrow. You know how she gets when she's picking out perennials." "I suppose," I murmured. I set his plate down. He likes his eggs slightly runny, with exactly 2 pieces of sourdough toast, burnt at the edges. I've prepared this meal roughly 4,000 times. As he ate, he didn't look at me. He looked at the newspaper, though I knew he wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere near the obituary section. "We should check the railing on the basement stairs," I said casually, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. Julian's fork clattered against the plate. He took a long, slow sip of orange juice before answering. "The railing? Why? It seemed fine when I went down to check the furnace last week." "I felt it wobble yesterday when I was taking the Christmas decorations down," I lied. There were no decorations. I'd finished that weeks ago. I just wanted to see his face. "It felt like it might give way if someone leaned too hard." Julian wiped his mouth with a napkin, his movements deliberate. "Don't worry about it, Elle. I'll take a look at it tonight. Just stay away from the basement for now. I don't want you tripping." The irony was a physical weight in my chest. I don't want you tripping. "You're so thoughtful, Julian," I said. He left for his office, a small rented space downtown where he mostly stares at a computer screen and pretends to consult for firms that stopped calling years ago. Once the front door clicked shut, I didn't start the dishes. Instead, I went to my sewing room. It's a small, cramped space off the kitchen, filled with bolts of fabric I never intend to use, and a sewing machine that hasn't been threaded in months. Inside an old beat-up hat box, tucked behind a stack of patterns, lies a slim, high-end laptop. I logged in. The interface of the Thorne Vance Private Trust appeared, a sea of deep blues and charcoal grays. The balance at the bottom of the screen was a number with far too many zeros for a woman who currently had $4.20 in her household purse. I spent an hour moving assets. I shifted a block of commercial real estate in Chicago into a new holding company. I authorized a wire transfer for a charitable foundation in my father's name. Then, I opened the encrypted file containing the surveillance feed from the house. I had installed the cameras 3 years ago, not out of paranoia, but out of a quiet, growing realization that I didn't know the people I lived with. I watched a recording from last night. There they were, Julian and my mother, sitting in the library. In the high-definition playback, I could see the sweat on Julian's upper lip. I could see the cold, calculating hunger in my mother's eyes. "The insurance is for $5 million, Julian whispered on the recording. "If we frame it as accidental death, the double indemnity clause kicks in, $10 million. It wipes Connor's debt and gives us enough to move to the coast." "And Eleanor?" my mother asked, her voice devoid of any maternal trace. "She's tired, Beatrice," Julian said, and for a second, he almost sounded like he believed his own lie. "She's been tired for years. This is just an early retirement." I closed the laptop. An early retirement. The front doorbell rang, a sharp, demanding sound that could only be Lydia. I hid the hat box and made my way to the foyer. My daughter stood there, a vision of polished, suburban perfection. Her blonde hair was blown out, her trench coat was cinched tight, and her expression was one of practiced annoyance. She didn't say hello. She pushed past me into the house, bringing the scent of expensive, floral perfume with her. "God, Mom, it smells like grease in here," Lydia said, tossing her keys onto the entry table. "Did you fry eggs again? You know how that smell clings to everything." "Your father likes them," I said, following her into the living room. Lydia sank into the armchair, the one she knows I hate her sitting in because she always leaves marks from her spray tan on the upholstery. "Look, I can't stay long. I just needed to ask, did Dad say anything about the bridge loan? Mark and I are looking at that property in the Hamptons, and the closing costs are just insane this month." "Your father hasn't mentioned it," I said. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my back straight. "I thought you were doing well, Lydia. Your Instagram showed you at that gala last week." Lydia scoffed, checking her nails. "That's optics, Mom. You wouldn't understand. Everything is about the image. We're just in a liquidity crunch. I was hoping you might have some of your emergency money tucked away. You know, that little stash you keep in the teapot."
She was talking about the $300 I keep for the plumber. My daughter, who wears a watch that costs more than my car, was asking for my grocery money. "I'm afraid the teapot is empty this month, Lydia," I said softly. "The heater broke, and the repairs were expensive." Lydia's face darkened. For a moment, the polished mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, ugly resentment.
"Of course. It's always something with this house. Honestly, Mom, you and Dad are such a drain. You live in this museum of a house, barely hanging on, while the rest of us are trying to actually build lives. It's selfish, really."
Selfish? I repeated the word as if it were a foreign language.
"Yes,"
she snapped.
"keeping this place up when you could sell it, move into a condo, and give your children their inheritance now, when we actually need it. But no, you'd rather sit here and rot in the dark."
I looked at her, the child I had stayed up with through fevers, the girl I had defended against her grandmother's sharp tongue, the woman I had quietly funded through 3 failed business ventures. She didn't see a mother. She saw a roadblock. "I'll keep that in mind," I said.
"Whatever,"
Lydia said, standing up.
"Just tell Dad to call me. And for God's sake, open a window. It's pathetic in here."
She swept out of the house without a backward glance. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she'd left. I walked over to the basement door. I reached out and turned the handle. It was locked. Julian never locks the basement door from the inside. I took a spare key from the top of the door frame and opened it. I didn't go down. I didn't need to. I took a small, high-powered flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shone it down the wooden steps. Near the 3rd step from the bottom, the wood looked different.
Darker. I leaned in and saw it. A thin, nearly invisible coat of clear industrial lubricant had been applied to the edge of the tread. And the railing, the sturdy oak railing I had polished for years, had been subtly unscrewed from its brackets. It was held in place by nothing more than gravity and hope. If I stepped there, I wouldn't just trip, I would fly. I heard the garage door opening. Julian was home early. I stepped back, locked the door, and replaced the key. My heart wasn't racing. If anything, my pulse had slowed to a steady, rhythmic thrum. I went to the sink and began to peel potatoes for dinner. The peelings fell into the basin like discarded skin. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Tomorrow was the day they had chosen for my ending. What they don't realize is that I've already planned the sequel. And in my version, No one gets an inheritance. Monday dinner was a quiet affair, though the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant silence of a dying marriage. It was the taut, vibrating silence of a trap being set. Julian was being unusually attentive. He insisted on pouring my wine, his hand steady as he filled the glass I rarely touched. He had cooked the roast, a rare occurrence, and kept urging me to eat more, to get my strength up. Across the table, my mother watched me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in its final hour. "You really should wear those comfortable loafers tomorrow, Eleanor," Beatrice said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "The nursery has those uneven stone paths. We wouldn't want you losing your balance." "I'll remember that, Mother," I said. I took a sip of the wine. It was a cheap Cabernet, acidic and sharp. Julian had stopped buying the good labels months ago, claiming the cellar was under renovation. In reality, he'd sold off the vintage bottles to pay for Connor's legal fees from a misunderstanding at a casino in Atlantic City. As if summoned by the thought of his own failures, the front door slammed. Connor stumbled into the dining room. He looked frayed. His tie was loosened, his hair matted with sweat despite the cool evening. He didn't look at me. He looked straight at Julian. "Did you get it?" Connor asked, his voice cracking. "The extension?" "They're not waiting anymore, Dad. They came to the office." Julian's face went pale. He shot a frantic glance at me before gesturing sharply for Connor to sit down. "Not now, Connor. We're having a nice family dinner. Your mother and I were just discussing her trip to the garden center tomorrow." Connor finally turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifying mixture of guilt and greed. He knew. Of course he knew. He was the reason for the early retirement. My life was the currency required to settle his debts. "Right," Connor whispered, sinking into his chair. "The garden center. Sorry, Mom. I'm just stressed." "It's all right, dear," I said, my voice dripping with a gentleness that felt like acid in my mouth. "We all have our burdens. I only wish you felt you could talk to me about yours." Connor flinched. He reached for the wine bottle and drank straight from Julian's glass. "There's nothing to talk about. Just business. You wouldn't understand the pressure of everything." "I suppose not," I said. "I've spent my life inside these walls. My world is very small, isn't it?" "It doesn't have to be," Julian interjected, his voice too loud, too eager. "After we get through this lean patch, we'll take that cruise you always wanted. The Mediterranean, just the two of us." I looked at him. I remembered the man I had married, the man who once promised to build me a cathedral of a home. Now, he was promising me a cruise with money he expected to collect from my corpse. The betrayal wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a cold, hollow ache that had replaced my ribs. "I'd like that," I lied. After dinner, I performed my usual routine. I cleared the table, I rinsed the plates, I loaded the dishwasher. I could feel them behind me, a triad of shadows in the living room, whispering. I didn't need to hear the words. I could feel the vibration of their intent. I went to the hallway closet and pulled out my old leather tote bag. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of gardening gloves, was a small digital voice recorder. I had bought it months ago, back when I first started noticing the way Julian and my mother would stop talking the moment I entered a room. I walked toward the library. The door was ajar. I didn't stop. I didn't linger. I simply walked past, reaching out with a practiced, invisible motion to slip the recorder into the deep pocket of the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the doorway. Then I went upstairs. I sat in the dark of my bedroom for a long time. Our bedroom. Julian was still downstairs working. I looked at the photograph on my nightstand. It was taken 20 years ago. Julian, Lydia, Connor, and me. We were on a beach. I was smiling, squinting into the sun, holding a toddler-aged Lydia. I looked at the woman in the photo and felt a profound sense of mourning. She had been so certain of her place in the world. She had believed that love was a shield, that if she gave everything of herself, she would be protected in return. I reached out and turned the photo face down. A few minutes later, the door opened. Julian entered, moving quietly, thinking I was asleep. He stood at the foot of the bed for a long time. I kept my breathing deep and rhythmic. I could feel his gaze on me. It wasn't the gaze of a husband. It was the gaze of a man looking at a problem he was about to solve. He walked over to my side of the bed and leaned down. For a sickening moment, I thought he might kiss my forehead. Instead, he reached for my phone on the charger. He checked the screen, likely looking for any outgoing calls or messages I might have sent to friends or lawyers. Finding nothing, he set it back down. "Sleep well, Elle," he whispered. I heard him leave the room. I heard his footsteps head toward the stairs, not the main stairs, but the back hallway that led to the basement door. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I got out of bed, my feet silent on the hardwood. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the house by memory, a ghost in my own hallways. I reached the library and retrieved the recorder from the curtain. I retreated to the sewing room, locked the door, and put on a pair of headphones. The audio was clear. "She's suspicious," Connor's voice said. "Did you hear her? She asked about my burdens. She knows something." "She knows nothing," Beatrice's voice snapped. "She's a librarian, Connor. She lives in books and dust. She's just being dramatic because she feels ignored. Tomorrow morning, I take her to the nursery. I'll make sure she spends 3 hours in the sun. She'll be dehydrated and exhausted by the time we get back." "And the stairs?" Lydia's voice. I hadn't even heard her come back into the house. "Is it ready?" "It's ready," Julian said. "The lubricant is set. I've loosened the 3rd and 4th brackets on the railing. It'll look like she grabbed it for support and the wood just gave way. Old house, dry rot. It's a tragedy everyone will believe." "And the money?" Connor asked, his voice trembling with greed. "How long until the payout?" "The Thorn policy is automated for accidental death," my mother said. 30 days. Maybe less if I talk to the board. I still have friends at the firm." I turned off the recorder. They were all there. My husband, my mother, my children. All of them standing around the blueprints of my death like they were planning a kitchen remodel. I looked at the sewing machine. I looked at the hidden hat box. I had been planning to simply leave. I had been planning to move the money, change my name, and disappear to a villa in Tuscany, leaving them to figure out how to pay for their own lives. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the static of the recording, I realized that leaving wasn't enough. They didn't just want my money, they wanted my absence. They wanted to erase the very person who had kept them fed and clothed for 3 decades. I stood up and went to the window. The moon was a thin, sharp sliver in the sky. Tomorrow was Tuesday. I wouldn't be going to the nursery. Or perhaps I would, but I wouldn't be the one coming home exhausted. I reached into the hat box and pulled out a burner phone I had purchased weeks ago. I dialed a number I had memorized. "It's me," I said when the voice answered. "The transfer for the estate's security team. I want them at the perimeter by 6 a.m., and I need the legal team to finalize the gift revocations. Yes, all of them. effective immediately. I hung up. I walked back to the bedroom, passing the basement door. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I lay back down in bed next to the man who wanted me dead, and for the first time in 30 years, I slept perfectly still. Tuesday morning arrived with a silence so thick it felt physical. I woke up at 6 a.m., as I always do, but I didn't get out of bed immediately. I watched Julian sleep. In the gray, pre-dawn light, his face looked slack, the lines of resentment around his mouth softened by unconsciousness. It's terrifying how ordinary a monster can look when he's dreaming. By 7:30 a.m., the house was a hive of forced care. "Here, Elle, drink this," Julian said, handing me a tall glass of orange juice. He'd even added a little umbrella from a cocktail set we hadn't used in years. "And take your vitamins. You'll need the energy for the nursery." I looked at the small white tablet sitting on the coaster. I knew my prescriptions. This wasn't one of them. It was likely a sedative, something to make my dizzy spell on the stairs look more convincing to a coroner. I picked it up, feigned a cough into my napkin, and slipped the pill into the pocket of my cardigan. "Thank you, Julian," I said, drinking the juice. It tasted metallic, but I didn't let my expression flicker. Beatrice arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, dressed in a crisp linen suit and a wide-brimmed hat. She looked like she was heading to a garden party, not a murder. She didn't hug me. She never does. She just surveyed my outfit, a simple pair of trousers and a light sweater, with a look of practiced pity. "You look haggard, Eleanor," she said, tapping her cane on the hardwood. "But perhaps the fresh air will bring some color to those sallow cheeks. Let's go. We have a lot of ground to cover." The drive to the nursery was 40 minutes of psychological warfare. My mother spent the entire time talking about my father, not the man he was, but the man she wished he had been. She spoke of the Thorn legacy as if it were a burden I had personally tarnished by marrying Julian. "Your father always said you were the soft one, Eleanor," she said, staring out the window at the passing trees. "Too much heart, not enough spine. He worried you'd be picked apart by someone more clever than you." "Is that what happened, Mother?" I asked quietly. "Do you think I've been picked apart?" She turned to look at me, her eyes cold. "I think you've been a very expensive disappointment. But today, we're going to find something beautiful for the front beds. Something that lasts." At the nursery, the plan became clear. Beatrice was relentless. She made me walk through the rows of perennials, then the shrubs, then the heavy concrete statuary. She pointed out things at opposite ends of the 5-acre lot, making me fetch a cart, then change it for a larger one. The sun was unseasonably hot for a Tuesday in May. My head actually did begin to throb, not from the vitamin I hadn't taken, but from the sheer weight of the betrayal. I watched my mother's back as she walked ahead of me, her stride brisk and youthful, while I intentionally lagged behind, playing the role of the exhausted, frail woman she wanted to see. I saw her check her watch every 15 minutes. She was on a schedule. "I think I need to sit down, Mother," I said, leaning against a wooden pallet of mulch. "I'm feeling quite lightheaded." A flash of triumph crossed her face, so quick most people would have missed it. "Already? Well, I suppose we've done enough. Let's get you home. Julian will be waiting." When we pulled back into our driveway, Julian was standing on the porch. He was wearing his work clothes, but he wasn't at the office. Beside him stood Connor and Lydia. The whole family was gathered for the accident. "Mom, you look terrible," Lydia said, though she didn't move to help me out of the car. She was busy scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving with a frantic, nervous energy. "The sun was a bit much," I said, leaning on Julian as he helped me toward the door. His grip on my arm was tight. tighter than it needed to be. "Let's get you inside, Elle," Julian said, his voice dropping into a soothing, oily tone. "I've got the AC running. Why don't you go down to the basement and pick out a bottle of that nice Chardonnay? We'll have a little toast to a successful garden day." I stopped at the threshold of the kitchen. The air in the house felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of Julian's cologne and my mother's floral perfume. "The basement?" I asked, looking him in the eye. "Yes," Julian said, smiling. It didn't reach his eyes. "The good bottles are in the back rack, remember? Near the furnace. Go on. I'll start the appetizers." I looked at my children. Connor was staring at his shoes. Lydia was looking at the ceiling. They knew the railing was loose. They knew the floor was slicked with oil. They were waiting for the sound of my bones snapping against the concrete so they could finally afford the lives they thought they deserved. "Actually," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally clear in the quiet room, "I don't think I'll go down there." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's smile faltered, then vanished. "Elle, don't be difficult," he said, his voice sharpening. "You love that wine. It'll help with the headache." "I think I'll just sit in the library for a moment," I said, turning away from the basement door. "I have some papers to look over." "The papers can wait," Beatrice snapped, her patience finally fraying. "Julian asked you to do a simple thing, Eleanor. Go and get the wine." I looked at my mother. The woman who had given me life was now trying to shove me toward my death over a bottle of wine. "No," I said. I walked toward the library, my steps firm and deliberate. I didn't limp. I didn't stagger. Behind me, I heard the frantic, whispered exchange. "What's wrong with her?" Lydia whispered. "She's just being stubborn," Julian hissed. "Give it a minute." I entered the library and sat behind the large mahogany desk, my father's desk. I didn't turn on the lamp. I sat in the shadows, listening to the clock tick. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Suddenly, there was a heavy knock at the front door. Not the tentative knock of a neighbor, but the authoritative, rhythmic strike of someone who isn't leaving. I heard Julian grumble as he went to answer it. "Can I help you?" His voice drifted into the hallway. "Mr. Julian Vance?" A man's voice, professional and cold. "I'm with Thorne Vance Security, and these gentlemen are from Gable and Associates." I don't understand," Julian said. "We didn't call for security." "We aren't here for you, sir," the man replied. "We're here for the owner of the estate, Eleanor Vance."
"We have several documents that require her immediate signature, and we've been instructed to begin the inventory of the household assets for the upcoming transition." I stood up and walked to the library door. I could see them in the foyer, 4 men in dark suits holding leather briefcases. Julian was backed against the wall, his face the color of ash. My mother had emerged from the kitchen, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning into terror. "Eleanor?" Julian turned to me, his voice trembling. "What is this? Who are these people?" I stepped into the light of the foyer. I looked at the basement door, then back at my family. "These are my employees, Julian," I said softly. "And they're here because I've decided to make some changes to the house, starting with the locks." I looked at Connor and Lydia, who were standing frozen in the kitchen doorway. "And Connor," I added, "I'd put the phone away if I were you. The creditors you're worried about? I bought your debt this morning.
You don't owe them anymore. You owe me." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a trap. It was the silence of a world ending. The foyer felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. The presence of the 4 men in charcoal suits, men who didn't blink, who didn't shuffle their feet, who looked at Julian as if he were a smudge on a blueprint, shifted the oxygen in the room. I don't understand," Julian stammered, his hand still gripping the edge of the front door. He looked at the lead attorney, a man named Mr. Gable, and then back at me. "Eleanor, tell these people to leave. You're confused. The sun, the heat today." "I'm quite cool, Julian," I said. I walked past him and stood in the center of the rug I had paid for, in the house I owned, surrounded by people who had spent the last 48 hours deciding how to dispose of my body. Beatrice stepped forward, her cane clicking sharply on the wood. Even in the face of this, she attempted to exert her dominance. "Eleanor, stop this theatrics at once. Who are these people? You have no authority to bring strangers into this house. This is a Thorne residence." "Actually, Mrs. Thorne," Mr. Gable said, opening a leather portfolio with a crisp, terrifying snap, "this property was transferred into the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust 3 days after her father's passing. You are here as a guest of the estate. A guest whose residency agreement, I might add, is currently under review." My mother's face went a shade of gray I didn't know the human skin could achieve. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The Thorne legacy she had used as a whip to lash me for decades had been a cage I built for her. I had let her believe she was the matriarch because it was easier than listening to her scream. "Mom?" Lydia's voice was small, stripped of its usual serrated edge. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life raft. "What is he talking about? You have money? You've always had money?" "I've always had my father's money, Lydia," I said, turning to her. "The money you've been begging your father for? It was never his to give. Every loan he provided, every investment he made in your boutiques and your husband's startups, that was me. I signed the checks. I approved the transfers. I just didn't put my name on the memo line." Connor made a sound, a choked, guttural noise. He looked at the men in suits, his eyes darting toward the basement door. He was thinking about the oil on the stairs. He was thinking about the railing. He was realizing that he had tried to kill the only person who had been keeping him out of prison. "You bought my debt?" he whispered. "How much?" "All of it, Connor," I said. "The markers in Atlantic City, the private loans from people who don't use lawyers. I own it all. You no longer owe the men who were threatening to break your legs. You owe the woman you were planning to watch fall down a flight of stairs." The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a vacuum. "Elle, sweetheart," Julian said, taking a step toward me. His voice had changed. The oily, soothing tone was back, but it was thin and trembling. "We can talk about this. We're a family. We were worried about the finances. We were desperate. You have to understand." "I understand everything, Julian," I interrupted. "I heard you in the library. I heard you on the stairs. I heard you discussing the velocity of my fall. I heard you calculating the double indemnity on a policy I canceled 5 years ago." Julian stopped. The blood drained from his lips. He looked at Beatrice, seeking an ally, but she was staring at the floor, her hands shaking on the head of her cane. "Mr. Gable," I said, not taking my eyes off my husband. Please begin the inventory. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every silver spoon. I want a full accounting of what belongs to the estate. And please, escort my mother to the guest wing. She is to remain there until her new living arrangements are finalized. New arrangements? Beatrice hissed, her eyes snapping up. You wouldn't dare. I have dared a great deal for 30 years, Mother, I said. I've dared to be silent while you insulted me. I've dared to be invisible while you exploited me. My daring has finally run out. The security team moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. 2 men stayed with Julian and the children in the living room, while the others followed Mr. Gable. They didn't shout. They didn't use force. They simply occupied the space, their presence a physical manifestation of the power I had finally decided to wield. I walked into the kitchen. The potatoes I had peeled for dinner were still sitting in the basin, turning brown in the air. I picked up the bowl and dumped them into the trash. I wouldn't be cooking tonight. I wouldn't be cooking ever again. Lydia followed me, her footsteps hesitant. Mom, I didn't know. About the stairs. I didn't know what they were actually going to do. I thought it was just talk. You know how Dad gets when he's stressed. I turned to look at my daughter. You knew the railing was loose, Lydia. I saw you look at it yesterday. You didn't say a word. You didn't warn me. You just asked for a bridge loan for a house in the Hamptons. I was scared, she cried, the tears finally starting to track through her expensive foundation. We're losing everything, Mom. Mark is going to leave me if we lose the house. I was just trying to survive. At the cost of my life, I said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. She just sobbed, a hollow, selfish sound that didn't move me in the slightest. I felt a strange, cold detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's family. Julian entered the kitchen, his face a mask of desperate contrition. Elle, please, let's go upstairs. Let's just sit down and— Don't touch me, Julian, I said as he reached for my arm. He flinched back as if I'd burned him. I'm going to my room, I said. The men will be staying in the house tonight, in the foyer and the hallways. If anyone attempts to leave with so much as a silver salt shaker, they will be detained. If anyone attempts to enter the basement, the police will be called immediately to document the safety hazards you've installed there. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his. He felt small. For decades, he had loomed over my life like a monument, his moods dictating the weather of our home. Now, he was just a man in a cheap suit, shivering in a kitchen he couldn't afford. I went upstairs. I didn't go to our bedroom. I went to the guest room at the far end of the hall, the one that looked out over the woods. I locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were still steady. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of the inventory, the opening of drawers, the clicking of cameras, the low, monotone voices of the men I had hired to dismantle my life. And beneath that, I heard the sound of my family, the whispered arguments, the sobbing, the frantic calls Connor was making to people who would no longer answer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small white vitamin Julian had given me this morning. I placed it on the nightstand. I wondered how many more pills were hidden in the house. I wondered how long they had been waiting for me to break. I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes. The house felt different now. The silence was no longer mine to maintain. It belonged to the lawyers now. It belonged to the contracts. But as I drifted toward a restless sleep, one thought kept circling my mind, sharp and jagged. They didn't just want the money. They wanted me gone. And I hadn't even begun to show them what gone truly looked like. The night did not bring peace. It brought the sounds of a house being surgically dissected. From the guest room, I could hear the rhythmic thud click of a high-speed camera. Mr. Gable's team was documenting the provenance of every painting, every rug, every antique clock. They were turning my home into a crime scene of greed, and for the first time, I wasn't the one cleaning up the mess. I looked at the white pill on the nightstand. It sat there like a tiny, chalky tooth. I wondered what it was. A heavy sedative? A beta blocker to induce a heart murmur? It didn't matter. Its purpose was the same: to make me compliant with the gravity of the basement stairs. A soft, hesitant knock came at the door. It wasn't the sharp rap of the lawyers or the heavy thud of security. It was light, almost a scratch. Eleanor, please, open the door. Julian. His voice was raw, stripped of the bravado he'd worn at dinner.
I didn't move from the edge of the bed. I didn't want to see him, but I wanted to hear him. I wanted to hear the sound of a man realizing his safety net had turned into a noose. "I know you're awake," he whispered through the wood. "The lawyers, they're saying things, Elle. They're saying you've been tracking our accounts for years. They're saying you've been testing us. That's not what a wife does. We were struggling. I was drowning. If you had the money, why did you let us suffer like this? Why did you watch me fail?" I stood up and walked to the door, but I didn't unlock it. I leaned my forehead against the cool mahogany. "I didn't watch you fail, Julian. I watched you pretend. I watched you spend money we didn't have on a life you hadn't earned. I gave you a comfortable home, a debt-free existence, and a wife who asked for nothing. You didn't fail because of a lack of money. You failed because you were never enough for yourself." "You lied to me for 30 years, he hissed, his voice cracking with a sudden, ugly flare of resentment. "You let me live like a beggar while you sat on a fortune. You made me feel small, Eleanor. Every day, looking at this house falling apart, knowing we couldn't afford the taxes. You did that to me." "I paid the taxes, Julian. I paid for Connor's tuition. I paid for Lydia's wedding. I did it all through anonymous gifts and lucky breaks for your firm. I wanted to see if you could be a good man without a bank balance to hide behind. I found my answer in the basement today." Silence followed. I could hear his heavy, uneven breathing. He was leaning against the door on the other side. Two people, married for decades, separated by 2 inches of wood and a lifetime of secrets. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Now," I said, "you wait for the sun to come up. And then, you start accounting for your choices." I walked away from the door and sat back down. I didn't sleep. I watched the shadows of the trees dance across the wallpaper. At 3 a.m., the house went quiet. The inventory team had finished the first floor. I slipped out of the room, my feet bare. I needed to see it. I needed to see the reality of my legacy. The hallway was dim, lit only by the recessed lights the security team had left on. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a figure sitting on the bottom step. It was Connor. He was hunched over, his head in his hands. A security guard stood 10 feet away, leaning against the front door, watching him with professional indifference. Connor looked up as I descended. His face was puffy, his expensive shirt wrinkled. He looked like the boy he had been at 10 years old, frightened and caught in a lie. "Mom," he croaked. I didn't stop until I was 3 steps above him. I looked down at the top of his head.
The men who were looking for you, Connor. The ones I paid off. They told my associates that you didn't just lose the money. You told them your mother had a hidden inheritance. You used my life as collateral for your bets before you ever even talked to your father about the stairs. Connor flinched. He didn't deny it. I was in deep, Mom. They were going to kill me. I thought if you were gone, the trust would open up. Dad said it would. He said you were the only thing standing between us and the money. I was the only thing standing between you and the world, Connor, I said. And I'm stepping aside now. What does that mean? He asked, his voice trembling. Are you going to send me to jail? You own the debt now. You can just wipe it, right? I own the debt, I said, and I will be collecting every cent. You'll work for one of the holding companies. You'll live in a studio apartment. You'll have a garnished wage until the day you die or the debt is settled. I'm not wiping anything, Connor. I'm finally giving you the responsibility you've been running from. He stared at me, horrified. To a boy who had been raised on the illusion of thorn wealth, a life of actual labor was a fate worse than prison. I turned away from him and walked toward the back of the house. I found Mr. Gable in the kitchen, drinking coffee from one of my chipped mugs. He looked up and gave me a respectful nod. We've secured the basement, Mrs. Vance, he said. The police have been notified of a hazardous condition and will arrive at 8 a.m. to file a report. We have the samples of the lubricant. It's a commercial-grade, high-viscosity oil. Difficult to see, impossible to stand on. And the railing? I asked. The brackets were partially sawn through, Gable said, his voice clinical. It was designed to hold the weight of a hand, but to snap the moment any real pressure was applied. It's quite deliberate, ma'am. I leaned against the counter. The weight of it was finally settling in. It wasn't just a plan, it was engineering. Julian had used his architect's mind to design my death. He had calculated the angles. He had accounted for the weight of my body. There's something else, Gable said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a manila envelope. We were doing a cursory sweep of the master bedroom safe, the one Mr. Vance thought was his. We found these. He slid 3 documents across the granite island. I picked them up. They were life insurance applications. Not for me. They were for Lydia and Connor. Julian hadn't just been planning to kill me. He had been hedging his bets. If I didn't die, or if the payout wasn't enough, he had policies out on his own children, with himself as the sole beneficiary. He was a man who saw his entire family as a collection of assets to be liquidated. I felt a coldness settle in my marrow that I knew would never leave. Does my mother know about these? I whispered. We haven't spoken to Mrs. Thorne yet, Gable said. She's been difficult. She's currently demanding a different brand of tea in the guest wing. I looked at the applications. My husband, the man who slept beside me, had been eyeing our children like livestock. I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned to see Lydia standing in the shadows of the dining room. She had been listening. Her eyes were fixed on the documents in my hand. Lydia, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't look at me. She looked at the papers. Then she looked toward the stairs where her father was likely still pacing. She didn't cry this time. She just turned and walked back into the darkness. The silence of the house was broken by the sound of a distant siren. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Tuesday was over, but the long, slow collapse of the Vance family had only just begun. At 8 a.m., the doorbell rang again. This time, the sound didn't carry the demanding weight of the lawyers or the desperation of my children. It was the flat, official chime of the local police. Julian emerged from the library, his face a map of exhaustion and terror. He looked at me, standing at the top of the stairs, and for a moment I saw the urge to run flicker in his eyes. But there was nowhere to go. My men were at every exit. The security he had always assumed I was too frail to understand had become a physical perimeter. I descended the stairs slowly. My knees didn't ache. The dizziness I had performed for months had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline stability. "Eleanor, please," Julian whispered as I passed him. "Don't do this. We can settle this as a family. Think of the scandal. Think of the children." "I am thinking of the children, Julian," I said, not looking at him. "I'm thinking about the price you put on their heads." I opened the door to Officer Miller and a younger deputy. I'd known Miller for years. He was the man who had helped me find our dog when she went missing a decade ago. He looked at the men in suits in my foyer, then at Julian, who was shaking visibly. "Mrs. Vance," Miller said, removing his cap, "we received a report of a hazardous domestic environment and a potential attempt at harm." "In the basement, officer," I said. My voice was as calm as if I were giving directions to the fiction section of the library. "The railing has been compromised, and the floor has been treated with an industrial lubricant. My husband was very insistent that I go down there yesterday afternoon." Julian took a step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of innocence. "It's a misunderstanding, officer. I was working on the stairs. I'm an architect, you know. I was doing repairs. The oil was for the hinges." "An architect who saws through his own railing brackets?" Mr. Gable asked, stepping out from the dining room with a tablet in hand. "And uses high-viscosity gear oil on a walking surface? That's a very specific type of repair, Mr. Vance." The police didn't wait. They went to the basement. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the hollow sound of their boots on the wooden steps. I heard the younger deputy let out a low whistle. I heard the scrape of a sample kit. While they were downstairs, I walked to the guest wing. It was time to deal with the architect of my oldest wounds. My mother was sitting in a floral armchair staring out the window. She had a silver tea tray in front of her, but the tea was cold. When I entered, she didn't turn. "You've made a spectacle of yourself, Eleanor," she said. "The neighbors are watching. The Thorne name is being dragged through the mud because you couldn't handle a little domestic friction with some dignity." "The Thorne name is mine, Mother," I said, sitting across from her. "It hasn't belonged to you since the day the probate was settled. You've been living on my charity for 30 years. Every pearl around your neck was bought with my signature." Beatrice finally looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, but I could see the underlying tremor in her chin. "You were always a secretive, vindictive child. Your father should have known better than to trust a girl who hides in corners. He trusted me because I was the only one who didn't view him as a bank account," I replied. I leaned forward, placing the copies of the insurance policies for Connor and Lydia on the tea tray. "Did you know about these? Or was Julian keeping his second act a secret from you, too?" She looked down at the papers. Her eyes moved over the numbers, the $1 million payouts, the accidental death riders. She didn't gasp. She didn't act surprised. She simply reached out and smoothed the paper with a manicured finger. "Julian was always thorough," she murmured. The coldness of her response should have shocked me, but it only confirmed what I had known in my marrow. To Beatrice, life was a series of managed assets. Even her grandchildren were just pieces on a board. "He was going to kill them too, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Once the money from my death ran out, he was going to liquidate his own children." "He wouldn't have had to if you hadn't been so stingy," she snapped, her voice suddenly shrill. "If you had just given us what we were owed, none of this would have happened. You forced our hands, Eleanor. You sat there in your plain clothes, eating your plain food. watching us struggle while you had millions. That is the real crime here. I stood up. I felt a strange sense of peace. The woman who had spent 60 years making me feel small was finally, utterly powerless. "You're leaving today, Mother," I said. "There's a car waiting. You're going to the Thorn Vance Assisted Living Facility in the city. It's a very fine place, secure, clean, but you won't have a phone and you won't have a checkbook. You'll have exactly what you gave me: a roof, 3 meals, and a lifetime of silence." "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I am Beatrice Thorn." "No," I said, reaching the door. "You're a guest who has overstayed her welcome." I walked back into the main hallway just as the police were leading Julian toward the front door. He wasn't in handcuffs yet. They were taking him in for questioning based on the hazardous conditions, but the way Officer Miller gripped his arm told me everything. Lydia and Connor were standing in the living room, watching their father be led away. Connor looked like he was going to vomit. Lydia looked different. Her eyes were fixed on the insurance policies I had left on the dining table. She walked over and picked them up. She read the names. She read the amounts. She looked at Julian. He stopped at the door, turning back to look at her, his eyes pleading. "Lydia, honey, tell them. Tell them I'm a good father. Tell them it was all a mistake." Lydia didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She slowly ripped the papers into 4 neat pieces and dropped them onto the floor. "I hope the cell is cold, Dad," she said. The door closed behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. I looked at my children. They were broken, greedy, and complicit. They had watched their father prepare my grave and said nothing. But they were also the products of the silence I had built. "The lawyers have prepared the paperwork for your new lives," I told them. "Connor, you have a flight to Chicago at 4 p.m. You'll be met by a supervisor at the firm. Lydia, your husband has already been notified that the bridge loan has been revoked. You have 48 hours to vacate your house before the foreclosure I initiated this morning begins." "Mom, please," Connor begged. "You can't just throw us out." "I'm not throwing you out, Connor," I said. "I'm letting you go. You've wanted my inheritance for years. Now you have it. You have the inheritance of my silence. Use it well." I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Through the window, I watched the police car pull out of the driveway. Behind it, a black sedan arrived to take my mother away. The house was emptying, the voices were fading, but as I stood there, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that I was finally alone in a house I had spent my life filling for other people. And then, my phone buzzed on the counter. A notification from the security team. Unidentified vehicle parked at the end of the lane. 1 occupant, watching the house. I looked at the screen. The curiosity loop tightened in my chest. Who else was waiting for me to fall? The black sedan waiting at the end of the lane didn't move. It sat idling, a dark smudge against the vibrant green of the spring oaks. I watched it through the library window, my fingers tracing the cold mahogany of the desk. My security team had already run the plates. It wasn't a creditor, and it wasn't the police. It was Mark Emerson, my son-in-law. I watched as the car door finally opened. Mark didn't step out with his usual swagger, the posture of a man who believed his wife's family was an endless well of passive income. He looked diminished. He stood by the driver's side door, staring at the house as if it were a fortress he no longer knew how to breach. "Should we have him removed, Mrs. Vance?" the security lead, a man named Elias, asked from the doorway. "No," I said. "Let him wait. He's spent 5 years treating this house like a drive-through bank. Let him see what it looks like when the vault is closed." I turned my attention back to the foyer. 2 men were carrying my mother's vintage trunks toward the waiting car. Beatrice followed them, her back as straight as a spear. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the portraits on the wall, the Thorn ancestors who had built the empire I now controlled. She didn't look at me. She looked at the house, mourning the loss of the status it provided, not the daughter who lived within it. "You think you've won, Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying across the marble. "But you've only succeeded in making yourself a target. Without the protection of Julian's name or my social standing, you're just a lonely woman with a large bank account. They'll come for you. People like Mark. People like the ones Connor owes. And you'll find that silence doesn't buy loyalty." "I don't want loyalty bought with silence anymore, Mother," I said, descending the last few steps. "I'd rather have the truth, even if it's cold." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "The truth is that you were always the help, Eleanor. You just had better jewelry. Enjoy your empty house." She walked out the door without looking back. I watched the taillights of her car vanish down the drive. The silence that rushed in afterward was absolute. For 30 years, my mother's voice had been the background radiation of my life, a constant low-level hum of critique and demand. Now, it was gone. I expected to feel a surge of triumph. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't grief. It was the sensation of a limb that had been asleep for years, finally beginning to wake up with a painful, pins and needles intensity. "Lydia is in the sunroom," Elias whispered. "She refused to leave with her grandmother." I found my daughter huddled on the wicker sofa, surrounded by the ferns I had tended to for a decade. She looked small. The bravado she had used to demand bridge loans had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified 30-year-old who realized her husband was waiting at the end of the driveway not to comfort her, but to see if she still had access to the money. "He's out there, isn't he?" Lydia asked, her voice flat. "Mark?" "Yes. He's been there for an hour." Lydia hugged her knees to her chest. "He's not waiting for me, Mom. He's waiting for a number. He told me this morning that if the Thorn money was gone, we were finished. He said he didn't sign up to live in a 2-bedroom rental in the suburbs." "And what did you sign up for, Lydia?" I asked, sitting in the chair across from her. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "I signed up for the life I was told I deserved. Dad always said we were special. He said the money was coming, that it was just tied up in your fears. He made you sound like a hoarder, Mom. A crazy woman sitting on a pile of gold while her children starved." "Did you feel like you were starving?" I asked. Lydia looked around the sunroom, at the expensive glass, the manicured lawn, the designer clothes she was currently wearing. "No, but I felt behind. Everyone else was moving faster. Everyone else had more. I thought I was just taking what was mine." "Nothing is yours until you earn it," I said. "Your father taught you that wealth was a birthright. I tried to teach you that it was a responsibility. It seems I failed." "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. "Mark is going to leave me. I have no career. I have no savings. You've taken everything." "I haven't taken anything," I said. "I've simply stopped giving. There is a profound difference. You can go out there to Mark and tell him the truth, that you are the daughter of a very wealthy woman who will not give you a single dime until you show her you can survive without it. If he stays, you have a husband. If he leaves, you have an answer." Lydia stood up, her movements jerky. She looked toward the driveway, then back at me. For a second, I saw a flash of the girl she used to be, the one who would hide behind my skirts when lightning struck. But the woman she had become was hardened by greed. "You're a monster," she spat. "You've been playing God with our lives, watching us struggle just to satisfy some sick sense of moral superiority. You could have saved us all years ago." "I did save you," I said softly. "I saved you from the consequences of your own choices for 30 years. Today is just the first day I'm letting you experience them." Lydia grabbed her bag and marched out of the room. I followed her to the front door and watched as she walked down the long driveway toward Mark's car. I watched them talk, a frantic, animated conversation through the driver's side window. After 5 minutes, Mark didn't get out of the car. He didn't open the door for her. He simply put the car in reverse, swung around, and drove away, leaving Lydia standing on the gravel, her designer bag at her feet. She didn't come back to the house. She began to walk toward the main road, her head down, a solitary figure in a world that no longer owed her a thing. I closed the front door and locked it. "Mrs. Vance?" Mr. Gable appeared at the top of the basement stairs. He was holding a small black ledger. "We found this in the crawl space behind the wine rack. It wasn't part of the estate papers." I took the book from him. It was old, the leather cracked and smelling of damp earth. I opened it to the first page. It wasn't Julian's handwriting. It was my father's. "For Eleanor," the inscription read, "in case they prove me right, in case the love is only as deep as the pockets." I felt a chill wash over me. My father hadn't just left me the money. He had left me a blueprint for the betrayal he knew was coming. He had known Beatrice, he had known Julian, and he had seen the seeds of their greed before I ever did. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a list of names of men in the city, politicians and business moguls, and next to them, dates and dollar amounts. And at the very bottom of the page, in fresh black ink that didn't match the rest of the book, was Julian's handwriting. "June 12th, the final payment. The insurance won't be enough. We need the Thorne-Vance liquidation." I looked at Gable. "Who is the final payment to?" "We don't know yet," Gable said, his face grim. "But it seems your husband wasn't just killing you for the insurance, Mrs. Vance. He was being extorted. And the people he owes are much more dangerous than Connor's bookies." I looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. The house felt quiet, but the air was thick with the realization that I hadn't just ended a war, I had simply moved to the front lines. The ledger felt like a cold stone in my lap. I sat in my father's library, the room that had always smelled of old paper and the specific cedar-scented tobacco he'd favored, and realized that I had spent 30 years playing a game where the rules had been changed behind my back. Julian's handwriting at the bottom of the page was frantic. It lacked the measured architectural precision he used when drafting floor plans or calculating the weight-bearing capacity of a joist. The ink was blotched, the J in his signature trailing off like a dying heartbeat. The final payment. The insurance won't be enough. "Mr. Gable," I said, my voice echoing in the vaulted room. "My father died of a heart attack in his sleep. At least, that's what the coroner's report said. But this ledger, these names, these dates go back decades." Gable sat across from me, his expression unreadable. He was a man paid for his discretion, but even he looked unsettled by the contents of the black book. "Your father was a very successful man, Mrs. Vance. But in the circles he moved in, shipping, real estate, city planning, success often requires arrangements. It appears Julian discovered these arrangements shortly after your father's passing." "And instead of telling me, he tried to step into my father's shoes?" I whispered. "Worse," Gable replied. "He tried to fill shoes he didn't understand. Your father knew how to manage these people. He knew how to keep them at arm's length with a mixture of leverage and loyalty. Julian? Julian only had greed. He stopped the payments 3 years ago, thinking he could pocket the arrangement money for himself. He thought he was smarter than the system your father built. And now they've come to collect, I said. The imbalance of my marriage suddenly made sense in a way that was almost nauseating. All those years Julian had spent belittling me, calling me plain and unambitious, mocking my desire for a quiet life, it wasn't just his ego. It was a defense mechanism. He was drowning in a sea of debt to people who didn't use banks, and he needed me to be the anchor so he wouldn't float away. He needed my frugality to cover the gaps. He needed my silence so he could pretend to be a titan of industry while he was actually just a servant to shadows. I stood up and walked to the window. The house felt dangerously large. Without the clutter of my mother's demands or the noise of my children's entitlement, the architecture itself seemed to press in on me. "Who is the board?" I asked, pointing to a name that appeared frequently in the ledger next to astronomical figures. "A shell company," Gable said. "On paper, they provide consulting services for urban development. In reality, they are a collection of old money interests that control the zoning of every major project in the tri-state area. Your father paid them to ensure the Thorne Vance holdings remained untouched. Julian stopped paying. He thought he could use the money to fund Connor's lifestyle and Lydia's social climbing." "And the liquidation Julian wrote about?" "The house, Mrs. Vance," Gable said softly, "and the land it sits on. It's the last piece of the Thorne Vance estate that isn't tied up in the trust. It's the only thing Julian thought he could sell without your direct authorization, if you were out of the picture." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The oil on the stairs, the sawn railing. It wasn't just about the insurance money, it was about the deed. With me gone, the house would have passed to him. He would have sold it to the board to settle his debt, and my children would have been left with the insurance pittance while the history of my family was bulldozed for a luxury condo development. He hadn't just been planning to kill me. He had been planning to erase me and everything I came from to save his own skin. My phone rang on the desk. It was an unknown number. I looked at Gable. He nodded toward the speakerphone. I pressed it. "Hello?" I said. "Eleanor." The voice was familiar, yet stripped of the arrogance I'd known for 30 years. It was Julian. He sounded like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "They're letting me make one call. You have to listen to me. You have to drop the charges. You have to tell the police it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake, Julian," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You engineered it. You calculated it." "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice rising in a panicked vibrato. "The people I owe. They don't care about the police. They don't care about your lawyers. They were promised the Vance acreage by the end of the month. If I'm in here and you're still there, they'll come for you, Eleanor. They'll come for the kids." "They've already come for the kids, Julian," I said. "You put a price on their heads with those insurance policies. Don't pretend you're protecting anyone but yourself." "The policies were a backup," he cried. "I was trying to find a way out. I thought if I had enough cash, I could buy them off without selling the house. I was trying to keep us together." "By killing me?" There was a long, jagged silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the background noise of the station, the low murmur of voices, the slamming of a door. "They're coming, Eleanor," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "They're already there. Look at the ledger. Look at the date for the final payment. It's tonight." The line went dead. I looked down at the ledger. June 12th. I looked at the clock on the library wall. It was 9:45 p.m. "Elias?" I called out. The security lead appeared in the doorway instantly. "Yes, ma'am." "I want the perimeter tightened. No one enters the lane. No one passes the gate. And I want the lights on the north side of the house cut. If someone is coming, I don't want to be the one standing in the light." "Who are we expecting?" Elias asked, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. "I don't know," I said, looking at the names in my father's book. "But I think it's time we met the people who have been living off my family's silence for 40 years. I sat back down in my father's chair. I didn't feel afraid. That was the strangest part. I had spent my life being afraid of my mother's judgment, afraid of my husband's temper, afraid of my children's disappointment. I had spent so much energy being the shock absorber for this family that I had no fear left for myself. I opened a drawer in the desk. Inside was a small velvet-lined box. I opened it to find my father's old signet ring. I slipped it onto my finger. It was too large, but the weight of it felt right. "Mrs. Vance," Gable said, looking at his phone. "I just received a notification. The Thorne Vance Holding Company in Chicago, the one where you sent Connor." "What about it?" "The office was served with a subpoena 10 minutes ago. Not for Connor, for you. Someone is filing a claim against the entire trust, alleging that the Thorne Vance assets were obtained through illegal coercion 40 years ago." I looked at the ledger. My father's secrets weren't just a debt. They were a time bomb. Julian hadn't just failed to pay the debt, he had triggered the demolition. The house creaked. It was a normal sound, the settling of old wood in the night air. But tonight, it sounded like a warning. "They aren't coming to kill me, are they, Mr. Gable?" I asked. Gable looked at the ledger, then at the darkened window. "No, ma'am. They're coming to take everything. They want to make sure that by tomorrow morning, you are as invisible as you've always pretended to be." I looked at the signet ring on my finger. "Well," I said softly, "they're about to find out that being invisible makes it very easy to see everyone else coming." A sudden sharp glare of headlights swept across the library ceiling. A car was coming up the drive. Not a police car, not a sedan. A heavy, dark SUV that didn't slow down for the gate. The curiosity hook in my chest tightened. I knew who was in the car. I knew why they were here. But they had no idea that the woman they were coming to evict was the only one who knew where all the bodies were buried. Literally. The SUV didn't stop at the gravel turnaround. It rolled onto the grass, its tires crushing the peonies I had planted 3 years ago. The headlights cut through the library windows, blinding me for a moment before the engine died. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and cold. A man stepped out of the back seat. He was tall, wearing a coat that cost more than Julian's annual consulting earnings. He walked toward the front door with the gait of a man who owned the ground he stepped on. Behind him, 2 younger men, the kind of men who looked like they were carved out of granite and expensive suits, followed at a respectful distance. "That's him," Mr. Gable whispered, standing back from the glass. "Silas Thorne, your cousin, the man who has been chairing the board since your father's passing." I didn't wait for them to knock. I opened the door before they reached the porch. Silas stopped, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. He looked at my plain sweater, my gray hair, and the way I stood, solitary and small, in the vast mouth of the foyer. "Eleanor," he said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "It's been a long time. I see the house hasn't changed. Still as stagnant as the day Uncle Arthur died." "The house is fine, Silas," I said. "It's the people inside it that have a habit of rotting." He laughed and stepped past me into the foyer without an invitation. He looked at the security guards, then at the boxes being packed by the inventory team. "I heard about Julian. A messy business. The basement stairs? Really? He was always a man of limited imagination. He lacked the elegance required for true thorn-level problems. He was trying to pay you, I said, closing the door. He thought he could trade my life for the deed to this land. Silas turned, his eyes glinting. And he was right. The debt he inherited from your father, the arrangements that kept this estate afloat, has come due. I have the papers here, Eleanor. Julian signed over the land rights as collateral for the final payment. Since he's currently incapacitated and the payment wasn't made, the board is here to take possession. You have until midnight to vacate. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single embossed sheet of paper. He held it out to me as if he were handing a scrap to a dog. I didn't take it. I looked at the ledger, Silas, I said. I saw the payments Julian was making. I saw the accounts they were going into. The board isn't a collection of old money interests. It's a shell company based in the Cayman Islands, managed by a firm called Meridian Holdings. Silas's smile didn't falter. Very good, Eleanor. You always were the observant one. But Meridian Holdings is a thorn entity. It doesn't matter who manages it. The debt is real. The debt is very real, I agreed. I walked over to the library desk and picked up a small, modern tablet. But there's something Julian didn't know. Something even my father didn't know. You see, 30 years ago, when my father first fell ill, he gave me the keys to his digital archives. He thought I was just filing his letters. He didn't realize I was learning the architecture of his secrets. I turned the tablet around. On the screen was a transaction history, not from the ledger, but from the master account of Meridian Holdings. I didn't just watch Julian, I said. I followed the money. I found out that 15 years ago, Meridian Holdings was quietly acquired by a private investor during a hostile takeover that never made the news. Silas, you haven't been the chairman of the board for over a decade. You've been an employee, a middleman, skimming off the top of a debt that was already settled. Silas's face went very still. The granite-faced men behind him shifted their weight. Who is the investor? He asked, his voice losing its velvet. The investor is a woman who realized very early on that silence is the most valuable commodity in the world, I said. A woman who used her modest inheritance to buy up every piece of leverage her family ever held. I didn't just fund Julian's failures, Silas. I bought the company he was paying his extortion to. For the last 10 years, my husband has been paying me to keep secrets I already knew. My mother has been living on a stipend I authorized. And you've been drawing a salary from a trust I control. I stepped closer to him. I was shorter than him, but I had never felt taller. I am the board, Silas. I am the debt. And as of 5 minutes ago, I've terminated your employment for gross financial misconduct. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas Thorne, the man who had come to evict me, looked at the tablet, then at the ring on my finger, then at the gray, plain woman standing in front of him. He realized that the invisible wife hadn't been a victim. She had been the architect. You let him try to kill you, Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp realization. You knew about the stairs. You knew about the oil. You could have stopped it weeks ago. I could have, I said, but I needed him to choose. I needed to see if there was a single ounce of the man I married left inside that shell of greed. He chose the stairs, and in doing so, he gave me the one thing I didn't have, the legal grounds to strip him of every protection the Thorne name provided. He didn't just fail to kill me, Silas. He signed his own death warrant. I gestured to Elias. Escort Mr. Thorne to his vehicle. He is no longer permitted on Thornvance property. If he attempts to access the Meridian accounts, the evidence of his skimming will be handed to the federal prosecutor currently waiting for my call. Silas didn't fight. He didn't even speak. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and a new, distorted kind of respect. He was ushered out of the house, his SUV reversing over the crushed peonies and disappearing into the night. I stood in the foyer, the front door standing open. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and freedom. Mr. Gable stepped up beside me. "What now, Mrs. Vance? The house is yours. The trust is secure. The family is gone." I looked up the grand staircase. I thought about the oil on the wood. I thought about the 30 years of dinners, the 30 years of insults, the 30 years of being the silence that held the walls together. "Pack the rest," I said. "The rest, ma'am?" "Everything," I said. "The paintings, the silver, the rugs. I want this house emptied by dawn. Not a single memory is to be left behind." "And where are you going?" I looked out at the dark woods. I felt the weight of the signet ring on my finger. Then I reached out and pulled it off. I set it on the entry table, the last piece of the Thorne legacy. "I'm going to a small town where no one knows my name," I said. "I'm going to buy a small house with a single floor. No stairs, no library. Just a garden that I'll tend for myself." "And the money?" Gable asked. "The millions?" I smiled. It was a quiet, tired smile. "The money will stay in the trust. It will be used to fund the very things my family hated: libraries, public parks, and shelters for women who have spent too long being silent. I'm done being an architect, Mr. Gable. I'm ready to be a stranger." I walked out the front door, leaving it wide open. I didn't take a suitcase. I didn't take a coat. I walked down the long gravel driveway, my footsteps crunching in the dark. Behind me, the lights of the great house began to flicker out, one by one, until the mansion was nothing more than a shadow against the stars. The silence was finally mine. And for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like a mask. It felt like home.